applying the lens of economic reasoning to the work of government and markets has given us a more objective understanding of how those institutions can best serve our goals of relief, recovery, and rebuilding in the wake of disaster. But while knowing what markets and government can and cannot do well certainly should inform our public debates about disaster policy, it may not do much to address our human desire to help, to do something for the victims. So in this lesson, we'll try to answer that question, the question of how we can best help. Earlier, we referenced Jack Hirshleifer's RAND study of disasters called Economic Behavior in Adversity. And we can return to Hirshleifer for a summary of the psychological studies of human response. He says, quote, "Even a narrowly limited disaster is of course total for those who do not survive it, and sufficiently catastrophic for anyone suffering severe personal loss and material damage. But he goes on to note that there are other people who are affected. In general, for any disaster, it's useful to consider three zones of effect: the total destruction zone, the partially damaged zone, and the economically linked but physically undamaged support zone." Now, by the way, that economically linked but physically undamaged support zone, that's you and me. Hirshleifer is referring to us, watching our TVs, accessing up-to-the-minute reports online, or waiting nervously for the "we're okay" calls from friends, relatives, and colleagues in the stricken area. Now, social scientists have identified typical psychological patterns of reaction in each of the zones, including by those of the millions of us in the support zone who aren't directly affected but feel pulled to help in some way. So first, let's look at the impact zones. In general, it's been found that the disaster syndrome displayed by a population suddenly struck by disaster does not include the wild, asocial behavior described by the more lurid popular writers on such themes. Panic does not normally occur. Survivors first reorient and extricate themselves and then their families. Some, even when seriously injured themselves, assist others. Others seem temporarily stunned or apathetic, in which condition they will respond to direction but are incapable of independently useful action. In the immediate post-impact period, a strong feeling of community identification is generated, and it promotes cooperative and unselfish efforts towards repair and relief activity. Gradually, however, this stimulus wears off after some days or weeks, and concern over unfairness of relief distribution and the like typically leads to considerable recrimination as a more normal society is restored. Now, by contrast, let's look at the support zone. A very marked psychological pattern called the counter-disaster syndrome typically takes place in the support area outside the impact zone of the disaster. The crisis calls forth a generous outburst of assistance, both personal and material, from the people in this zone. Volunteer rescuers converge on the disaster area, food and medicines are freely contributed, refugees are welcomed in reception areas. For many smaller disasters, the material support has been so great as to exceed emergency needs. Sometime later, however, a reaction may set in, leading to bad relations between victim and support populations and accusations of ingratitude. In localized disasters, at least in the recent history of the Western world, relief has poured in so quickly and copiously as to preclude any substantial degree of what might be called secondary mortality from exposure and starvation, though of course there will still be much suffering. The repeatedly demonstrated willingness of the support population to put out extraordinary efforts with an exceptional degree of unselfishness in the crisis period is a crucial element in making recovery possible. So Hirshleifer concludes in Economic Behavior in Adversity. So the question then is not how to motivate communities to support the victims of disaster, but to anticipate the natural outpourings of sympathy, to be aware that time and distance will quickly erode that support or sympathy, and to be prepared to channel the charitable inclinations of those in the support area in the most useful ways. And it turns out that we have another institutional sector in our society, the nonprofit organizations, that has forged a comparative advantage in transforming these charitable impulses of individuals into effective disaster relief. So let's look at the rules of the game and the incentives for this institution. And then we'll also look at the paradox that one of our most impersonal tools of interaction, money, turns out to be the best way to express our personal feelings of sympathy for the disaster victims. The bottom line is that our desire to help in times of disaster is most effective when we channel it through the community of nonprofit charitable organizations. They've developed, through specialization, a comparative advantage in providing relief services that untrained, unorganized individuals, ad hoc groups, and government agencies don't have. That comparative advantage derives from the experience, efficiency, and innovation that result from producing day in and day out the services we tend not to notice until a disaster strikes. Mary Thoreau, former chairman of the National Advisory Board, explained the effectiveness of the Salvation Army after Hurricane Katrina by saying essentially that it's what they do every day, and in the process they've become very good at it. Or, as she put it, based from their operations already well established in nearly every community, where they work daily in permanent shelters with the homeless and poor and with people trying to put their lives back together, the Salvation Army's volunteers are well prepared to meet the needs of victims of natural disasters. Its military-style structure is designed for rapid mobilization and puts a premium on training people in advance to deal with disasters. Now, by doing a quick, intuitive cost-benefit analysis, you recognize the comparative advantage of the mechanic to repair your car, or the geek in your third period class to install new software on your computer. Making a similar evaluation, other entities within our society, even for-profit businesses, have recognized the comparative advantage of nonprofits in providing emergency assistance. While Walmart was busily shipping truckloads of strawberry Pop-Tarts and baby diapers to hastily repaired and reopened stores in the Gulf Coast, it also donated $20 million. But when it came to Walmart's donations, some in cash and some in goods, they gave them to the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and established shelters already operating in the New Orleans area rather than distributing themselves. And Walmart isn't alone in recognizing that it will get the most for its money by turning the money over to the nonprofits. It's the commonly chosen route for corporate philanthropy. For example, the corporate gifts that made up most of the $700 million in U.S. private contributions to the Tsunami Relief Fund in 2005 were funneled through the Red Cross and the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF. And you may remember from an earlier lesson that in the era before the existence of sprawling federal government agencies like FEMA, even government disaster relief, like that for the victims of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, was administered through the Red Cross. A more recent incident also gave evidence of the specialized skills of the nonprofit relief organizations. Remember the fiasco of the $2,000 FEMA debit cards that were offered to victims of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita? After stories of spending on strip clubs, divorce lawyers, and fancy vacations caught the attention of the national media, the debit card giveaway came under close scrutiny and was pretty quickly shut down. Subsequently, an investigation by the Government Accounting Office, or GAO, suggested that as much as 16% of the money distributed was for fraudulent purposes. The GAO concluded that FEMA had failed to take even, quote, the most basic steps to confirm the identities of about 1.4 million people who sought cash assistance. Now, I'm not suggesting that we can excuse abuse of emergency funds by individuals, but from an institutional point of view, a really critical question here was the inability of FEMA to manage and verify whether someone actually qualified for assistance. The GAO reported to Congress that at least $1 billion in disaster relief payments by the Federal Emergency Management Agency were improper and potentially fraudulent, because the recipients provided incomplete or incorrect information when they registered for assistance. The examples of fraud and abuse included payments to registrants who posted post office boxes, UPS stores, and cemeteries as their damaged property addresses. And without the proper verification, it's not surprising that FEMA continued to pay these fictitious disaster registrations even when they were set up by the GAO as part of a forensic audit. In one case, FEMA paid nearly $6,000 to a GAO undercover employee who submitted a vacant lot as his damaged address. Now, by comparison, what many people were unaware of is that here's FEMA touting this plan to issue debit cards as a bold new innovation in expediting assistance. But the Red Cross has been doing this for a long time. The Red Cross Client Assistant Card is pretty much business as usual. And while we would certainly never claim that the Red Cross is fraud-proof, the incidence level after Katrina was minuscule by comparison to the 16% estimate in the Gulf Coast. Why? Well, I think we're back to comparative advantage, a comparative advantage honed by the experience of organizations that screen aid applicants day in and day out and put volunteers through extensive training programs designed to reduce the incidence of fraud. In addition to the comparative advantage developed through specialization, the nonprofit sector in our society benefits from the systemic decentralization that Hayek identified as necessary to overcoming the knowledge problem. Remember the knowledge problem from Lesson 2? That the rapidly changing knowledge of the specific circumstances of time and place is almost impossible to tap into through institutions that operate on centralized decision-making? Well, the decentralized nature of the nonprofit community makes it, like markets, a relatively effective transmitter of knowledge to decision makers. In this case, it takes information about people who need assistance and matches it up with third parties willing to provide it. For the historians in the group, it may also be interesting to speculate on how our preference for limited government, upon which our nation was founded, has played a role in developing the comparative advantage of nonprofits. After all, we have centuries of experience in relying on voluntary action and community organizations to provide aid for individuals suffering hardship. Alexis de Tocqueville is perhaps the earliest and most famous commentator on Americans' affinity for voluntary civic organizations, including social groups that provided mutual assistance. In the early 19th century, he commented, "Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. They have not only commercial and manufacturing companies, but also associations of 1,000 other kinds, religious, moral, serious, feudal, general or restricted, enormous or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found seminars, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the Antipodes. In this manner they found hospitals, prisons, and schools." And he might have added, they help one another in times of hardship. Well into the 20th century, the first line of relief and support for Americans was manned by family, friends, churches, and community. The penchant for forming voluntary aid societies that de Tocqueville had noted persisted. In the absence of social insurance programs, fraternal societies provided members with support in times of unemployment, illness, or disaster. Many collected and distributed death benefits. University of Alabama historian David Beto estimates that 1/3 of the adult male population of the United States, from all levels of the socioeconomic range, belonged to fraternal societies at the turn of the 20th century. So, we have a lot of experience with this, and perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that many charitable organizations have become quite adept at what they do. In fact, we even have specialization within the field of charitable support. Witness the groups formed solely for the purpose of rescuing and caring for disaster victims' pets. Okay, but there's another concern we have to address. Even if you're convinced that nonprofit institutions have a comparative advantage in disaster relief, how do you know that you can trust them? I mean, we saw evidence in Lesson 3 of the increased public corruption convictions associated with large pots of government relief money. Well, money comes rolling into nonprofits after a disaster too. How do we know that the relief organizations aren't equally susceptible to exploitation? Good question, and with a somewhat surprising answer. They compete. Yes, the invisible hand leaves its fingerprints all over the nonprofit sector too. It turns out that nonprofits, unlike governments, operate in a market-like arena. The donations that allow them to serve their self-interest by engaging in charitable activities are scarce, and charities must compete for them. In this arena, as in the for-profit arena, market-like incentives influence the behavior of donors. For example, studies of nonprofit revenues after hurricanes reveal that just as the first business to a disaster area with provisions for victims stands to benefit handsomely from beating other businesses, so do the nonprofits that proceed fastest and most effectively. The faster they are on location to help those in need, the more likely are potential charitable contributors to give additional money to their organizations. Competition in the nonprofit arena has the following characteristics. When charities are perceived to do a good job of using donations to assist people in need, their donations increase. When charities perform poorly or gain a reputation for fraud or mismanagement, they receive fewer donations and must make do with smaller budgets. Donors' self-interest gives them an incentive to monitor the activities of charities to which they make donations, and their task is made easier by services, many of them found on the internet, that investigate nonprofits' finances and publish analyses and ratings of their effectiveness. Internet rating sites and other communication innovations have reduced the donor response time. Any hint of scandal or malfeasance quickly damages a nonprofit's reputation, and donations dry up. Now, I know this all sounds good, that the invisible hand of competition helps to regulate nonprofits, and that donors can monitor their activities. But does it really happen? Well, we do have some evidence that it's more than just a theory about the way things should work. A representative example, and probably one of the most notorious in recent memory, was the brouhaha involving the Red Cross after the terrorist attack on 9/11. You may remember that there was a scandal that led to National President Bernardine Healy being forced from office, even if you don't remember the actual story. Briefly, the story was that a problem arose when donors found out that money they had contributed to the Liberty Fund, which had been set up by the National Red Cross for aid to 9/11 victims and their families, was leaking into the treasuries of local Red Cross chapters that had been unable to fully fund their local charitable activities. Public outrage, fueled by media coverage, spawned numerous investigations and significant changes in the disbursement policies of not only the Red Cross, but other major philanthropic organizations. While the National Red Cross did survive, and in fact continues to thrive, the blowback from the scandal took a big toll on many of its local chapters. For example, a news story covering the resignation of the director of a New York chapter noted that, like other nonprofits, this Red Cross chapter has struggled to raise general funds during times when donors want their money set aside for victims of specific disasters. The chapter has blamed its losses on a drop in donations following 9/11 and donor wariness due to the National Red Cross's initial refusal to earmark all $1 billion raised by its Liberty Disaster Fund for the families of 9/11 victims. A December 2002 report by the Brookings Institute called for attention to the relationship between public confidence in nonprofits and the level of charitable giving, noting that despite the outpouring of support for victims of 9/11, the charitable community as a whole suffered from donor suspicion. The report warns nonprofits that in the days of media scrutiny and low-cost access to information, the goodwill Americans have traditionally extended to charitable organizations is no longer a given. Quote, "The controversy surrounding the disbursement of more than $2 billion collected by various September 11th funds proved to have a lasting negative effect on public confidence in the charitable sector. Americans paid a great deal of attention to the rash of stories about the difficulties dispersing funds to the victims of September 11th, said Paul Light, the Dillon Chair in Governance Studies at Brookings. Professor Light regards public confidence in the nonprofit sector and the sector's actual performance as inseparable. Public confidence in charitable organizations such as the Red Cross and United Way is essential to a high-performing charitable sector, he said. Confidence affects almost everything that matters to the future of the sector, especially the public's willingness to contribute money and volunteer time. Even a small decline in confidence should raise alarms across the nonprofit sector. A study by New York University Graduate School of Public Service in October 2005 that was reported in the Philanthropy News Digest echoes the warnings of the Brookings Institute, confirming that the center's studies have shown, quote, a clear and significant statistical relationship between general confidence and willingness to contribute discretionary dollars and time to nonprofits. In addition to the news media, ratings services enhance competition among nonprofits by reducing donors' transaction costs of finding organizations that will use their money effectively. The American Institute of Philanthropy's Charity Watch, Charity Navigator, and the Better Business Bureau's Wise Giving Allowance are only three of the well-known raters whose websites offer one-click access to information about the nonprofit's budget, history of donor complaints, and compliance with accountability standards. So, like markets, the nonprofit sector has a feedback mechanism that charities must respond to stay in existence. While the nonprofit sector of the economy cannot truly be called a market, it does seem valid to claim that charities operate in a market-like environment in which a scarcity of the resources necessary for the organization to pursue its self-interest fosters competition and the accompanying incentives. Those incentives, in turn, spur the specialization that gives nonprofits a comparative advantage in providing disaster relief. And that means that understanding the institutional parameters of nonprofits helps us answer the title question to this lesson. When disaster strikes, what can we do? What we can do is to channel our sympathy and desire to help through the organizations best suited to the task. How do we do that? Well, one obvious answer is to join a charitable organization as a volunteer, and many people do that. But what if it's not practical for you, or for the opportunity cost is too high? Or what if your volunteer work at the local library or homeless shelter doesn't seem to satisfy your desire to help victims of a tsunami in Asia? Then what? Well, get ready, because lots of people don't like the answer that's coming. The best thing to do is send money. Right. Send money. Oh, you cry, but it seems so impersonal. If we really cared, we'd do something, not just get rid of our guilt feelings by slapping down some cash. I can hear it now, the chorus that arises because of the disconnect between our very personal feelings about disaster victims and the very impersonal nature of money. But let's think this through. Remember that little activity about nobody knows everything, and the question about people sending their old clothes for disaster victims? The nonprofits refer to the phenomenon of having to deal with all sorts of unwanted donations as the second disaster. And if you think about it, the label makes sense. It takes resources, time, energy, knowledge, money to get rid of things you don't need. And that means fewer resources left to commit to your goal of helping the victims. So the second part of this lesson is about money and the role that it plays in disaster relief. We began this study of disasters by defining institutions as the expected and accepted forms of interaction. Now, if you think about expected and accepted forms of behavior or interaction, it should occur to you that there are some very noticeable differences between expected behavior in personal interactions and that in impersonal interactions, or as some institutional economists refer to them, face-to-face and commercial interactions. We accept and expect different incentives, that is, different rewards and punishments in face-to-face relationships than we do in impersonal commercial relationships. Intangibles like love, duty, honor, friendship are important incentives in the face-to-face world. But consider for a moment how much of the world we operate in on a daily basis is not personal. Or better yet, imagine trying to operate in that world on the basis of only personal relationships. It would be impossible. And interestingly, Adam Smith realized this in 1776. In The Wealth of Nations, he noted that we stand at all times in need of the cooperation and assistance of great multitudes. And he went on to explain that we cannot expect to obtain cooperation or assistance from other people's benevolence because we can't make that many friends. Think of all the people you depend on to make your coffee, your clothes, fill gas into your car, and you don't know them. If we can't relate personally, then how are we to get along in the huge stranger societies we live in? The answer is money. And before you again protest that money is so impersonal, consider this, that it's precisely because money is impersonal that it serves us so well in the commercial world. Paul Hayne, author of The Economic Way of Thinking, calls the impersonal nature of money its chief virtue. He says, precisely because of its impersonality, we can use money to facilitate mutually advantageous transactions among millions of people who know little or nothing about one another personally. When we want pizza while traveling through a town we've never visited before, we just step into a pizza place, order a medium thin with sausage and green peppers, and in 10 minutes, we're eating pizza. We don't have to find a pizza purveyor who likes something we're carrying in the trunk of our car, or who would appreciate an hour or so of the labor services in which we happen to have specialized, or who is willing to provide us with a pizza because he shares our religion or admires our politics. We do our thing in return for money, he does his thing in return for money. We can each promote the interests of the other very effectively because we both value money. So, what does that have to do with disasters? Well, recognizing that personal and commercial interactions have different rules of the game goes a long way to explaining why it sometimes feels uncomfortable to just send cash after a disaster. Modern communications technology blurs the distinction between the personal and commercial worlds when disaster strikes. When we see people suffering, it feels personal, and we yearn for a personal response. And yes, there are those of us who have skills, talents, and associations that make our physical presence and personal contribution to relief valuable. I don't want to imply that volunteers aren't valuable after a disaster, but for those of us who are more removed, understanding the role and power of money may also help us understand the value of donating only our money. The nonprofits themselves support this argument. You might think it would save them time and effort when we send stuff, but it doesn't. Because of that, remember, nobody knows everything hurdle? When asked, charitable organizations say that the most valuable contribution people can make is money. Interaction, the American Council for Voluntary International Action, offers several reasons why cash is best. Cash allows disaster relief professionals to procure exactly what is needed in a disaster situation. And remember that we have already established that they have the comparative advantage in knowing what is needed. People's desire to help is admirable, but we can't make the mistake of thinking that our good intentions excuse any outcomes. I remember a colleague at my school district's phone bank after the Columbine High School shooting answering a call from someone who wanted to donate a horse. Yes, a real live horse. The donor was sincere and caring and obviously distraught by the televised images of the carnage. And yes, it sounds callous to tell this concerned person, could you please just sell the horse and send the money? But really, a horse? And if you think that's outlandish, I could just as easily say, but really, old clothes? You want to send old clothes? The point is that we don't know what's needed. And if we divert the scarce resources of the relief agencies to deal with unwanted items, then don't we bear some of the responsibility for needed services that don't get purchased and don't get distributed? Okay, on to the next reason. Cash is the most effective donation because it doesn't use up scarce resources and because it can be transferred very quickly. There are no transportation and storage costs. Good point, huh? Or what about this? Did you think about cultural sensitivity? Cash allows the nonprofits to purchase supplies that are appropriate to the local culture and environment, and to help the economy of the area by purchasing them from local sellers. There are many cultural and environmental factors to consider when providing disaster relief, and the American public may be unfamiliar with the local climate, culture, and tastes. For example, food must be familiar to the affected people and fit within their overall consumption patterns. Okay, so before we leave the subject of money, I want to add one additional side note. Intuitively, we understand that disasters transform the process and systems of exchange. But exactly how does it work? When the banks are closed, your checkbook's floated away, your credit card readers don't work, even if you can find your credit card. Well, we don't seem to have much choice then. We tend to fall back onto a cash economy. And that's a problem, since in normal times, only a very small portion of exchange is conducted in cash. So where does all the cash come from when we need it? The addendum to the Lesson 4 outline looks at the role of the Federal Reserve System in making cash available after a disaster in the United States. The addendum has some links to some excellent resources to help students understand more clearly both the nature of money and the functions of the Federal Reserve System, particularly its role in helping to facilitate a post-disaster cash economy. Okay, let's wrap up this lecture by reviewing our big ideas. We've identified, in addition to markets and government, a third type of institution operating in our society, the nonprofit. As the name implies, they're not motivated by profit, but we've discovered that they do share some characteristics with profit-driven enterprises. Very importantly for their effectiveness in disaster relief, charitable institutions operate in a market-like environment and face market-like incentives. First, donor dollars are scarce, and nonprofits must compete for donations to accomplish their goals and interests. Next, the nonprofit sector is, with some exceptions, largely decentralized, and therefore better able than centralized institutions to respond to the rapidly changing circumstances of time and place associated with disasters. Nonprofit organizations have, through experience and specialization, developed comparative advantage in providing many types of relief services. Most individuals don't have a similar comparative advantage and can best funnel their desire to help victims by supporting the activities of reputable nonprofit groups. Our conclusion, then, is that the answer to the question of what we can do to aid the victims of disaster is to let those with the comparative advantage do their jobs. If we're not skilled or trained in disaster relief, the best way to aid victims is to search out a reputable aid organization and donate money that will allow the organization to purchase and deliver the goods and services the victims need.